Dr. Murray Rothbard is a leading libertarian theorist and the author of two of the most important books in the libertarian library, Man, Economy and State, and Power and Market. He is professor of economics at Brooklyn Polytech and edits the monthly journal Libertarian Forum. He is frequently being quoted as the major economist by newspapermen in leading the opposition to President Nixon's wage price controls. He's written articles on the op-ed page, has been quoted in the Daily News and many other newspapers, and has recently been in Washington, D.C., where he debated Herbert Stein, Nixon's economic advisor responsible for inflicting the wage price controls upon us. This time I'd like to introduce Dr. Murray Rothbard. At this time, I'd like to reintroduce Mr. Frank Bond to finish some business that we started earlier in the afternoon.
You know, I don't see too well without my glasses, and I was talking about some unpretentious gentleman who happened to be Milton Friedman, and I thought was Murray when I initially came up on the podium, and I was waiting for him to approach, and he didn't. I looked back, and he just looked away, and so
what is this award?
Here we go again.
Okay.
This is being presented by SIL, the Society for Individual Liberty. It's an Outstanding Achievement Award for intellectual achievement to Dr. Murray N. Rothbard in recognition of extraordinary contributions to the advancement of libertarian economics.
Thank you very much.
Hold this up. Somebody want to get a picture? Who's taking the picture? Okay. Well. I wanted to ask Murray an economic question before he takes over. I was wondering if you could give us an economic definition for the word appetite.
Appetite?
Appetite.
Can't do it on the spot.
A leading economist that was recently here defined appetite as, let me get this right, as an instinct thoughtfully implanted by Providence as a solution to the labor question. Do you have any comments?
I think that's a fine religious statement.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank. If I had known that the award was going to be presented earlier, nobody really told me about it, so I had to weigh the marginal utility of sleeping as against hearing Dr. Friedman, and sleeping won out. If I had known that the award would have been presented, it would undoubtedly have pushed me over into coming in earlier. I'm not going to talk about the wage price controls until tomorrow. So that I have a lot of interesting things, I think, to say about my debate with Dr. Stein and the whole approach of the Nixon administration, which is almost unbelievable. What I'm trying to talk about today is the, before I get started, since we're holding up things, some kind friend just presented me another award today before I came in. Pass me that in the bag. No, this is, thank you. This is, prepare me for the next time I confront another old enemy of mine, Bill Buckley. And since Mr. Buckley feels that my whole point of view is encompassed in the fact I'm in favor of private lighthouses, I was presented with this private board. always kind of amazed me why Mr. Buckley is so concerned about the lighthouse question. It seems to be the only point about libertarianism he's interested in. And there are all sorts of interpretations which I'll pass over in silence. One is the Freudian interpretation. The other is the economic determinist interpretation, which is my own special bailiwick, which is that Mr. Buckley is concerned about keeping the subsidies that the taxpayers have to pay to his yacht, which sails up and down the coast and provides with free light. At any rate, these are all preliminary. What I'm trying to talk about today is our attitude toward the American past, American history, early American history. And there are essentially two opposing attitudes that we've all confronted or grown up with. The general attitude on the right wing, which most of us, I guess, began with, is the attitude that everything essentially was great. The founding fathers were quasi-divine figures. America was generally a free country until something evil happened in 1933. Franklin Roosevelt was elected, and everything after that went to pot. There's some of the more scholarly proponents of this point of view also dig into the alleged Fabian conspiracy, which loomed, in dark corners behind the Roosevelt election. But basically, this is the approach that America was in really great shape, hunky-dory, whatever, until 1933, when suddenly dark night descends. The contrasting point of view, the other polar opposite to this, isn't held by too many people. My old friend Jim Martin, the best example of this, author of an excellent book, by the way, called Men Against the State, which I recommend to everybody. Jim Martin's approach is that everything historically in the past and present is essentially chaos and old night. Everything is evil, monstrous, terrible, except for two or three people who popped up in the 19th century, Lysander Spooner, Benjamin Tucker, and so forth, who were great. Everything else before and after them was evil. I'm of course simplifying a little bit. That's essentially the point of view. I think since I'm always, or in most cases, the middle of a rotor, I take a middle position here between these two polar extremes. I don't think that America was necessarily in great shape before 1933, and I don't think that everything was bad either. The way I look at history is that essentially from ancient Sumeria on to the present day, there have been two broad tendencies, despotism and liberty. And there have been conflicting and shifting, fluctuating results in these two forces. In ancient Sumeria, as far as we know, I don't know too much, but as far as we know about ancient Sumeria, which was the first great civilization, it was essentially libertarian at first. And then in the course of warfare between different cities and tribes, the state was imposed upon the civilization. And so we have then these sort of vectors clashing through history. Now, generally what's happened is that until Western Europe around the 17th century, the vectors are usually in the wrong direction. In other words, usually statism won out. So that the historical record before 17th century, looking at all civilizations, was essentially despotism. Sometimes a little more moderate, sometimes more intense. And then in Western Europe in the 17th century, especially in England, there arose a basically libertarian movement, quasi-libertarian movement, neo-libertarian movement, which essentially changed the course of world history in a libertarian direction. This movement, known later as classical liberalism, whatever you want to call it, set the stage for the Industrial Revolution, set the stage for the expansion of science and freedom and the free market. In the United States, getting into the colonial America, what we had was essentially a conflicting situation. Not everybody, the old legend was that everybody came to the United States to seek freedom. It's not quite true. the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay, for example, came to the United States, as one historian said, not to flee persecution, but to flee error. They didn't like the fact there was a lot of error going on in England, and so they came to Massachusetts to impose a rigid theocratic despotism in this area. The great thing about the American situation was it was a lot of land, mostly uninhabited. And so the attempt to set up despotism in the American continent founded on the fact that you could always get out. You could always leave. Usually you couldn't, of course, leave in very rapid fashion. The people getting out of Massachusetts Bay usually had to walk. It was always in the winter somehow they did this. They were usually kicked out in the winters. They had to walk across the snow to Rhode Island, which was the Libertarian haven, a really anarchistic haven in those days. But they somehow managed to do it. And also the English crown tried to establish in the American colonies a feudal land monopoly kind of system, duplicating what they had in Europe. They could, but the attempt foundered again on the fact there was hardly any people here. In other words, the Duke of York was assigned the entire New York State area as his private ownership, and Berkeley and Carteret received New Jersey, and so forth and so on. But the point was, the reason why they didn't hold on to it, the reason why we're not paying rent to the Duke of York as of today, is because they wanted quick profits. There were no people, to benefit them. So they started subdividing the land and selling it to settlers. And in this way, this individual settler was able to get ownership of his area. In some cases, the feudal overlord tried to keep collecting rent, even after the person settled in the area. Say in Pennsylvania, William Penn was assigned the entire ownership of the Pennsylvania area. And Penn kept trying to collect what was known as quit rents, which is essentially feudal rent. And the people there came to the conclusion, this is true in the entire American colonies, as a matter of fact, came to the conclusion they really owned their houses and lands, and they didn't really owe quit rent to the Duke of York or William Penn or whatever, and they just refused to pay it. And they founded, this was the first example of a tax rebellion in the United States and in this area, and they refused to pay it, and so they couldn't collect it. And the whole quit rent concept withered away on that basis. Well, so what we had then, in Massachusetts Bay, we had an attempt to establish severe, rigorous Puritan despotism. There has been, I have to concede this, a revisionism in the wrong direction among historians the last 20, 30 years, because the current trend among historians in Massachusetts Bay was, it's really simplistic to claim it was tyrannical. These people were really great people. They were learned. They read the Bible very carefully. They composed poetry and so forth. This is the Massachusetts revisionism. I don't hold with it. I don't really care if they wrote poetry and read the Bible and knew Greek. I mean, to me, this is unimportant compared to the fact they were imposing essentially totalitarian despotism. They were cutting off the ears of anybody who dissented, for example, from the ruling theocratic regime. So, and when you weigh these things in the balance, cutting off the ears of dissenters weighs a little bit more heavily than the fact that they could read the Bible carefully. So, at any rate, what we had then is, since we had a lot of open land, people could get out. They could even walk across the snow. So there arose then in the 17th century essentially three anarchistic areas, where there was literally, as far as we know, no government. One was Albemarle, which was the northeastern North Carolina at this point. Between about 1630 and 1660s, the English crown was deficient in granting the entire area to some duke. In other words, it wasn't granted to anybody. It was a grantless area. And so those Virginia settlers who didn't like Virginia for various reasons, for various good reasons, the despotism of the large planters, of the Anglican Church and so forth. So they got out and they moved down to northeastern North Carolina. And very little was known about that whole experience. So all we know is that for about 30 years there were people happily living there, fishing there or whatever, and there was no government as far as we know. There was also no chaos breaking out. There wasn't any wasn't any general slaughter of the innocents. Things, you know, popped along pretty successfully for those days. And unfortunately, we don't know very much about him. This is one of the problems in historical writing is, in most historical periods, most of the written records were left by the state, because ordinary people who were trying to, you know, get along and make a living didn't bother writing much or setting down records or scribing tablets. And so most of the records we have are state records. And so there's very little known about the history of the anarchistic period in North Carolina. We only know the history after the land was granted to the various dukes, and the whole state apparatus began to move in. But that needs research. Maybe intrepid researchers can find out more about it. So that was northeastern North Carolina. That anarchistic idyll came to an end in 1660s when the whole area was granted to various dukes. The second more important anarchistic area was what I mentioned before, Rhode Island. Rhode Island also had been, somehow they forgot to parcel it out among the various nobility, and Connecticut had been parceled out, and New Haven Colony, which is near Connecticut, was parceled out, of course, Massachusetts, and Plymouth, but Rhode Island was a free area. So when people were kicked out or left Massachusetts, they walked across the snow to Rhode Island and founded the various towns and settlements and so forth, and which was virtually anarchistic, and there was virtually no government for many years. The first great settler in Rhode Island was the famous Roger Williams. He was a very interesting character. I commend your attention. He started off as a libertarian purist and great champion of religious liberty, which in those days was fantastic. He wanted religious liberty not just for his own religion, but for all other religions, which is almost unheard of in that period. And but as the time went on, his libertarianism began to crack. As far as I can see, there's several reasons for this. One was the continuation in power. Power began to go to his head after a while. For example, in the 1630s, when he first got started in Rhode Island, he was a purely anarchic libertarian type. After about 30 years as the head of the little colony, he began to talk about, he said, we can't have full liberty because the society is like a ship. It was the famous ship analogy. Society is like a ship, and of course everybody knows to have a ship, you have to have a captain running it. So you have to have a captain steering the ship and making sure there's nothing going on in the hold and that sort of thing. And he, of course, was the captain. So that began, the corruption of power began to work its way in Williams. Plus the fact that people were popping up who were even more individualistic and more libertarian than he was. And there's apparently a syndrome in the history of libertarian thought that anybody who's more libertarian than you really hate the guts of, as we might have seen this afternoon. And this is what happened to Williams. Williams is a great libertarian, terrific, and so forth. And somebody comes along like Samuel Gorton, who's one of the most fascinating figures in American history, a magnificent character, who got kicked out of every colony he went to. Because every time he went somewhere, he propounded his own individualistic religion and politics, and they kept saying, "This is too much. It's too individualistic. You're out. Kick him out." And he came from England. Gorton. He was a great figure. He was fleeing persecution in England. Comes to Massachusetts Bay. They quickly kick him out of there, of course. He goes to Plymouth, which was a little less totalitarian. They kick him out of there. He winds up in Roger Williams' area. They kick him out. The only place in the whole Western world that would take him was, they had to found his own settlement, which later became Warwick, Rhode Island. And then there's a whole saga, which almost an unbelievable saga, of how Massachusetts tried to crush Warwick, tried to send troops there and aggressing it to stamp it out. And they never quite succeeded, but it was touch and go for quite a while. It was a heroic character, Gorton, magnificent fellow. Was constantly arguing about the fact that his cows were being taken for taxes and things like that. Incidentally, it was a great tradition in America. When somebody's cows were taken for tax default, his friends would get together and raid the courthouse and get the cow. First they get the cow back, then they lock the guy up, and then his friends would rally and they raid the courthouse and get him out. So there's a whole tradition, all during the 17th century, there was a constant local tax rebellions. Of course, compared to what the taxes are now, it was incredible. In those days, the taxes were much lower, obviously. There was also a heroic figure, probably I would say the first anarchist, first explicit ideological anarchist in the history of America. That was Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson, again, a fascinating character. She came to Massachusetts Bay. As a religious disciple of Reverend John Cotton, who was one of the great leaders of the colony. She began to deviate and claim that each individual should seek his own inner light. And this was intolerable, of course, to Massachusetts authorities. And she was kicked out. And she and her husband and a few friends founded another colony in Rhode Island. The thing was, that the interesting thing about Anne Hutchinson is that as most other radicals, by radical, of course, I mean anybody differs sharply from the existing status quo, as almost all radicals have undergone treatment among American historians, she was smeared viciously by current historians, by at least writing in the 40s and 50s, because the theory of historians for many years, and still, I guess, is slightly fading out now, that anybody who's really radical is a nut. I mean, to put it bluntly. This is usually dressed up in all sorts of psychoanalytical jargon. So anybody who differs from status quo is all of his or her neuroses are examined on a microscope, and they come to the conclusion, well, of course this person is against the government. He or she was a nut. In the case of this was, of course, the classic case of this is William Lloyd Garrison. I'm of course skipping here. Great leader of abolitionism in the 19th century. Garrison, by the way, was an anarchist. Very few people realize this. He was known as the leader of the no-government forces among the abolitionists. To him, abolishing slavery was just one step to the eventual abolition of government itself. And Garrison, until very recently, the last 5 or 6 years, has been considered by historians as just crazy. Well, of course, he was status anxious. He was Oedipus complex, whatever it was. I mean, there's all sorts of ways of psychologically smearing somebody, and each one of the changes was rung by the historians. In the case of Anne Hutchinson, it's almost too obscene to report. The smearing of Anne Hutchinson, the last version I know of was Emery Battis, wrote a book called Saints and Sectaries in 1962, which reduced the whole thing. Well, of course she was against the government. She was menopausal. Well, of course, there were, I don't know how many millions of women have been menopausal in history, and there's only been one Anne Hutchinson, so it hardly goes to explain the entire doctrine. Anyway, she was an extreme proponent of religious liberty. She was kicked out of Massachusetts Bay, walked across the snow to Rhode Island in a traditional manner. And then she got into an interesting thing. At that point, she was just a religious libertarian, basically. And then she got then she got arguing with one of her followers named Covington, and began to set up a little despotism in the little area, in the little colony, claiming that the claim was that he got all of his orders from God, and therefore he should be obeyed implicitly in all things. And while in the course of this political struggle, she began to think. Mrs. Hutchinson began to think deeply about politics. She came to the conclusion, well, it's true. The government should have no power, no influence, or no power in the religious field. Why should there be any government at all? And so she came to the conclusion there should be no government, period, no magistrate, no magistracy, as the phrase went. And at that point, this was, of course, fairly sort of unpalatable, even to her main followers. And her husband happened to die at that point, so she then moved with her family to a little house in Pelham Bay here, which the Hutchinson River Parkway, that's her. It's right near, of course. She was unfortunately wiped out by Indians because she was caught in the Dutch-Indian War, the Dutch having slaughtered Indians unmercifully, and shortly before, Indians began to get a little edgy and didn't distinguish carefully between her and the Dutch. But at any rate, this was the first American anarchist. And then individualist anarchism as a theory sort of drops out for a while, and 10 years later it's resuscitated with her sister, Mrs. Catherine Scott, and a whole bunch of other people who were the founders of the Baptist faith in Rhode Island. And so here were the whole collection of Baptists, all of whom were anarchists. Great anarchist ginger group, including Roger Williams' brother, Robert, which made Roger Williams even more edgy about the whole thing. Williams began to move toward conscription at this point. And it was, he imposed conscription, you know, the ship and the captain and all that, to conscript the galley, the people on the galleys. And so there was a little mini revolution, which nobody knows much about, the anarchist revolution against Roger Williams. It was crushed, but the leader of the revolution was elected to the council the next few months later, so it wasn't, you know, obviously it wasn't very repression. And so it was a strong anarchist contingent there for quite a few years. Finally, William Harris is another great character. He was a leader of the Baptist anarchists. Was circulating a petition in Rhode Island attacking Roger Williams' tyranny by this time, denouncing all taxation and all civil governments. He called upon the people who would cry out, "No lords, no masters." And he predicted that the state, this is of course a typical libertarian thing, unfortunately, we tend to be a little over-optimistic sometimes. He predicted that the state, which he called the House of Saul, would inevitably grow weaker and weaker and be replaced by the House of David, which happened to be him and his 10 or 12 followers. And he also condemned all officials, all legislative assemblies, all government, period. And he was then charged by the Williams administration with open defiance against our charter, all our laws, Parliament, the Lord Protector, and all governments. Which is, of course, a terrible thing. Mrs. Scott had been silenced by the repression of the previous thing. William Harris was continuing on. He swore to maintain his anarchism with his blood. He said that he that can say it is his conscience ought not to yield subjection to any human order amongst men. The General Court of Rhode Island found, of course, Harris guilty of being contemptuous and seditious, and they sent the evidence to England to try him for treason. Now, fortunately for Harris and for the cause, the libertarian cause, the ship never got to England. There was a big ship casualty rate in those days, and so the treason trial never materialized. All the evidence went down with the ship. So Harris was saved, and unfortunately he was finally silenced, and they finally shut him up. And then he abandoned his official anarchism, but he spent the rest of his life suing Roger Williams in court for all sorts of land claims. He was a great suer. And they're constantly going, no, I own this block here, and so forth, and he had Williams tied up for practically the rest of his life as retribution. Well, that was essentially the Rhode Island. Well, one of the main reasons, which I should mention, for both Williams falling from libertarian grace and the whole thing collapsing, is the fact that in England, the Levelers, who were the great libertarian wing of the Puritan Revolution, were crushed and wiped out by Cromwell, who took over as dictator. And when Cromwell came in, Williams began to lose his libertarian impetus because he'd been very friendly to the Leveler cause, and Cromwell was beginning to crack down all over the place, and Williams, I guess, also felt that he had to battle the winds. The third great anarchist experiment in 17th century America was Pennsylvania. This is another very fascinating story. Pennsylvania was much more populous than Rhode Island. Rhode Island didn't have too many people. Pennsylvania was founded 1680s, and within a few years, about 10,000 people, 12,000 people flooded in. It was a quick settlement for that period. And William Penn was granted the ownership of the entire area. He was pretty, I didn't get a chance to get into the Quakers. The Quakers were very libertarian also. And the Quakers were constantly being persecuted. Just unbelievable saga of the Quakers. They'd constantly go to Massachusetts Bay, and before being kicked out, they'd be dragged across the cold stream, and they'd be dragged up the tail of a cart, and then they keep walking back. It was just an incredible story. At any rate, even, of course, Williams persecuted the Quakers and so forth. So finally the Quakers get their colony in Pennsylvania, and Penn is set up as the feudal landlord and so forth, and has the government. And Penn then leaves. He thinks everything's going fine. He leaves back to England. Because no real aristocrat worth his soul would stay in a crummy place like America. No central heating or whatever. So they went back to England. Well, what happened then is some interesting thing happened. The government just sort of disappeared, Pennsylvania government. As far as I can see, first they didn't pay us quit rents, as I said before. No, just nobody paid it. That was the end of that. Secondly, there were no taxes. The reason was that they said, well, we won't levy any taxes for the first few years, so people, inducing people to settle. So there were no taxes, and then people settle, and then they refused to impose that any. So there were no taxes, period, for quite a while, something like 10, 15, 20 years. No taxes. Then Penn had granted to himself and his family a monopoly of the lime production, lime quarries. And the people just ignore that. They just went ahead and open up their own lime quarries. And so Penn was sitting there in London getting more and more excited. There's no quit rents coming in, no taxes coming in, no lime quarry monopoly revenue coming in. What in the hell is going on out there? He starts sending letters, to the government council. What's happening? Why am I not getting taxes and so forth? So it turns out that, first of all, there were two houses, the council and the assembly, I think they were. They were both at odds, and they never passed any legislation to fix that. Neither would agree to anybody else's legislation. That effectively crippled the legislative arm. The executives weren't getting paid. There was a great tradition those days of the unpaid government official. So, which we should restore, by the way, I think. And they weren't being paid in the local areas either. Since they weren't being paid, they weren't very diligent about their work. So they meet a few times a year or something, and they get the hell out and go back to their regular business. So the council very rarely met. Essentially, and the government, the executive arm never really functioned at all. So there they were. There was essentially no state government, no colony government, and local governments. As I said, there was no permanent bureaucracy because nobody was paid. So local courts met about 3 days a year. That fixed them. The county officials also. And so essentially there was no local government either. So there we were. There was no local government. There was no colony-wide government. And again, there was no general chaos broke out. There were no reports of anybody being murdered in their bed. Everything was great shape. As a matter of fact, since Pennsylvania had uniquely friendly relations with the Indians, since they never slaughtered them without looking when they weren't looking, there was no Indian problem either. So it was just a fantastic, everything's nice and peaceful, everything's going along in a very happy fashion. But Penn keeps griping that he's not getting his revenues. Where's the tax money? Where's the quit rent? So he points. So finally, he decides, he's going to kick out Thomas Lloyd, who was the governor, because he wasn't doing anything. He's going to kick him out. Appoint a real hard-nosed Puritan type named John Blackwell, a rough, tough character from none of this namby-pamby Quakerism. It's okay to have Quakers when you want to collect taxes. You don't have any Quakers doing it. You have a good tough Puritan. So he sends Blackwell to America, take charge in Pennsylvania. It is a magnificent saga, a very heroic libertarian saga. Blackwell lands in New York, which is of course the general port. Wires sends word down to Philadelphia to have him met with full honors. He's taking over as governor. And nobody answers him. So he comes to Philadelphia. He comes to Philadelphia. He's expecting a real guard of honor, and nobody shows up. Here he is. He gave an inauguration, and nobody came. Nobody shows up. It's fantastic. Where's the guard of honor? Where's the military brigade or whatever? Nobody's there. And there's only one small boy, I think, was there, throwing stones at him. So finally he goes to the Council of State, essentially the governor's cabinet. Where is it? Can't find. Finally finds it. It's the lock. The door is locked. There's cobwebs all over. Everything had been used for a year and a half, and there's no government. As they said, he found the council room deserted and covered with dust and scattered papers. The wheels of government had nearly stopped turning. So, gotta do something about this, And so he decides he's going to pass laws and so forth. Then the Pennsylvanians then embarked on a conscious, shrewd, brilliant, determined campaign of nonviolent resistance to this guy, Blackwell. What they did was that Thomas Lloyd was the previous governor, anarchic governor, didn't do anything. He had been officially assigned by the Penn as the keeper of the Great Seal. the Great Seal of the Colony of Pennsylvania. Before any government, before the government of Pennsylvania could do anything, they had to have the stamp of the Great Seal on that document. He refused. He locked the seal up somewhere and refused to use it. So this effectively stopped Blackwell from doing anything. Just refused to do any stamping. And so there's always a big headache there between Blackwell and the other people, and they stood firm. Blackwell did find one guy, some one Quisling type, who put him up in his house. So otherwise, he couldn't find any accommodations. Nobody would rent a house to him or sell him anything. And so this went on for this went on for quite some time. Finally, Blackwell gets disgusted and leaves. And this continued really until after the Glorious Revolution, when the king reimposed threatened to reimpose royal rule, and then and Penn comes back in, and even then there was considerable defiance. But by that time, the Quakers had been split in religious schism, and there was the Keithian schism, which was a big thing. And Keith was even more anarchistic than the rest of the colony at that time. But with the struggle between the Keithians and the others, Penn was finally able to reestablish the state again. It took about something like 15 years to do it. As an ironic footnote of the whole thing, Keith himself, who led this libertarian wing of the Quakers, finally winds up years later as a tough Anglican, I think he was, imposing sedition charges against dissenters in New York. But at any rate, that was a heroic episode in Pennsylvania. As I say, during this entire period of fairly populous for that day, and with essentially no legislature, no executive, no county officials, no local officials, no nothing. Everything was going along in a great shape. I mean, Pennsylvania was flourishing, it was prosperous, it was free, and so forth and so on. And this is so if you're interested, if anybody asks you how can this work, this is ridiculous, you can start pointing to things like this, pointing to Pennsylvania in the 1680s, pointing to Rhode Island and earlier, and North Carolina, plus other things. But I think it's important to re-examine this old tradition. Thank you.